Hi there, my name is Bryn, and today we're going to be doing some reacts basically to a few YouTube stuff about the event industry. And in this particular video, we're doing the top 10 worst concert tragedies by What's Metal. So yeah, we're going to be talking about that and, you know, some of the tragedies that happen in this. It's going to be a bit of a dark one. It might split over multiple parts. We'll probably do 2 parts to this. So stay tuned for the second part and let's get right into it, shall we?
Number 10, Dimebag Darrell Shooting. I just talked about this one in one of my recent videos, but it would be wholly inappropriate to not mention it here. In December 2004, the band Damageplan were performing at a small club in Ohio. Damageplan grew out of the ashes of Pantera, with brothers Vinnie Paul and Dimebag Darrell being the main selling point of the group. Fans crammed into the Alrosa Villa nightclub to see the highly respected musicians up close, unaware that it would be one of the most tragic nights in heavy metal history. You see, failed Marine, schizophrenic, and wannabe Gomer Pyle, Nathan Gale, had developed a psychotic obsessive paranoia around the brothers, believing they were speaking to him through album notes and stealing his identity. As the band were just seconds into their first song and the crowd lit up with excitement, Dickhead McGee went through the back door, stormed onto the stage with a Beretta 9mm pistol, and executed Dimebag, shooting him 3 times in the back of the head. While the audience was still trying to comprehend what had just happened, some thinking it was part of the show, the band's head of security tackled the prick but was also shot and killed. The reality of the situation started to settle in as everyone panicked.
Call 911, somebody!
While Dimebag Darrell lays on...
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's the fact that you might think that it's part of the show when really it is not part of the show.
Dickhead Shooter ended up killing 2 more people as they attempted to help the already deceased guitarist. Shooter Dickhead McGee ended up injuring another 3 people before taking a man hostage. Thankfully, it was right at that time that police officer and possible Terminator James Nickmeyer entered through that same back door with a badass Remington shotgun and gave old Gale a nice 12-gauge face shave.
Moments later...
So this is obviously a tragedy. It's very difficult to prevent shooters that come into a venue like this because of the fact that, you know, he's come through a back entrance. If you go through, most people go through the front entrance. So, you know, nowadays we have a lot more security measures in place to stop people from getting in with firearms, machetes and knives and things like that, especially in the UK. But yeah, it's a pretty hard thing if someone just slips in through the back, which usually is the most vulnerable point in a venue, is the back of house, which usually doesn't have a security guard on it for smaller bands. Obviously this isn't a small band by any means, but it is possible, like for a nightclub sort of venue like this, that they wouldn't have security on the back door to prevent people from getting in. It's pretty easy to get into most smaller venues through the back. And if you're wearing, like, just say a high-vis, or you're wearing, you know, clothing that makes you look like your crew, or you're, you know, in the band's part of the band, then yeah, it makes it pretty difficult because there's no accreditation either. There's no accreditation sort of for smaller gigs, so there's no way to identify people who are part of the band and who are not part of the band. And yeah, I mean, in terms of this starting really quickly and people thinking it was part of the act, then yeah, I can totally agree that it might have taken quite a few number of minutes before people realized that this wasn't actually wasn't part of the show.
Officer Niggemeyer steps in front of the camera, shotgun in hand, a blank look on his face.
The band had only made it 90 seconds into their first song, and just another 3 minutes later, Dimebag, the Dickhead Shooter, and 3 others were dead, with many others injured and traumatized, and the world of rock and metal music left with a permanent scar. And how did a schizophrenic psychopath even get his hands on a pistol? His mom had given it to him as a present. Thanks, Mom.
Of course, you know, I'm not going to touch US gun law with a 10-foot pole, but, you know, guns are obviously very prevalent in US society. Around the world, obviously, you can get access to firearms, even in strict countries like the UK and Australia. But, you know, we don't really have that same issue, especially in Australia, where, you know, we banned pretty much most firearms in the 90s after the Port Arthur massacre. So, you know, we don't really have as much of an issue with firearms in venues. In fact, I can't even think of any case where there's been a firearm brought into a venue in recent history, especially not in recent history where it's led to a death of anyone. And in the UK, the problem is not so much firearms and small arms, it's more knives and machetes, actually, and sort of bladed objects, which is still a massive problem in the UK and especially in London. So, certain events will attract certain people, and certain people will try and bring in knives and stuff, where gangs will be attending these sort of concerts. We have a lot more security measures now in place to prevent that. And the comments in terms of the schizophrenic guy, I mean, it's a guy with mental health disabilities. You can't. I mean, as much as he was wrong in what he did, he obviously had mental health issues. So they're impossible nearly to combat. You don't know what people are like and what people are going through their minds. Anyways, let's move on to the Who Crush of 1979.
Number 9, The Who Crowd Crush 1979. This one is just strange to me, as a lot of the factors that made this happen just seem stupid. Imagine you go to see the hottest band out there at the top of their game. You get there early so you can get the best spots, and as you're finally trying to get through the doorway, you're trampled to death by thousands of other fans. That is sadly what happened when legendary rock band The Who performed at the Riverfront Coliseum in Ohio on December 3rd, 1979. 18,000 people were waiting to get inside the show, which featured first-come, first-served seating. Many fans had been waiting outside for several hours, eagerly awaiting the venue doors to open. As it got closer to showtime, fans became more impatient, and those in the back started pushing forward to get in, not realizing the doors hadn't opened. The people in the front started getting pinned against the glass doors, unable to move due to the sheer amount of people pushing against them. At the same time, the venue was severely understaffed and not prepared for a crowd this size. Despite having a lot of doors all around the venue, only 2 were to open. 2 doors for about 18,000 people. Have you ever seen a meat grinder? As the 2 doors opened, fans piled in as the few security who were there tried to hold them back to check tickets. As this happened, reports state that either The Who began a sound check or a trailer for their film was being played over the speakers. Whichever it was, The Who's music began blasting through the speakers, and all the fans outside suddenly thought that they were missing the concert. The crowd anxiously surged harder to get inside, unknowingly condensing the meat grinder of the 2 doors even tighter. People started to go down and were impossible to pick up again. Someone would fall and they were just gone, buried beneath the tangle of legs and bodies. People were helplessly trampled on by thousands, many of which so condensely packed that they weren't even aware that they were standing on top of dying humans. Or if they were, there was just simply nothing they could do about it. Security and others tried to pull people out of the crush, but they were packed so tight that people's clothes were being fully ripped off of them as they were coming through. This crowd crush lasted about 30 minutes until enough of the crowd had made it inside, but that's when the true horror of the situation was revealed. 11 people, all very young, had died. Some from being unable to breathe, some from being trampled to death. Piles of clothes were laying around that had been ripped off. The crowd was condensed so tightly that when some people died, they were kept in a standing up position. And surprisingly enough, the concert continued. In fact, the band hadn't...
Alright, so just so I don't forget certain points, so with crowd crushes nowadays, what we do is we have, especially for mass participation events like this, where we have lots and thousands and thousands of people, obviously there's a lot of planning that actually goes into this specific thing, which is how do we manage the crowds. And in fact, you can actually get degrees in that in crowd management. So with this particular situation, what we would do in the events industry nowadays, from instances like this, which the events industry has learned from, is set up barricades. So we don't use rope and pole, we don't use the tether barricades and tether poles where you have that plastic sort of ribbon that you see at airports and things like that. We use a lot of steel barricades to manage crowds, to make sure that there is a line that goes from around and snakes around, so that everyone who's supposed to be going to the concert can line up in an appropriate manner. And, when the bad thing with this event is obviously when they played the music, people think that the bands have started, and that was obviously a turning point for this particular situation. But, when you have only 2 doors open, your ingress and egress are going to be severely hampered because there's not enough people going through. And when you get people pushing up against windows and glass, there's literally no way for them to get through. And, we look at these sort of situations now. having the appropriate amount of staff is so important to ensuring that these events, the entry of two events like this, are handled in a safe manner. So when we have events like this, we also separate into different areas. So you'll have one area that is for scanning tickets, the next is for doing security check, and then the next is for when people want to leave their bags somewhere or they want to do coat check and things like that. So I think it's in this particular tragedy, it was an accumulation of a lot of factors. They didn't have enough barricades. They didn't have enough staff. Trained staff is also important. They don't even need to be security. They just have to be ushers or people who are trained in surging crowds. And you can even nowadays have people going up and down the line, scanning tickets, stamping people, so that when they get to the doors, they're already scanned and ready to go in. And I imagine in this particular situation, because they only had a certain amount of staff for security, certain amount of people who were scanning tickets, if they were doing the same role, I don't know, but usually you have security and then you have people scanning tickets. I usually put them into two separate roles and two separate people because they're two separate jobs. So in this particular situation, when you have a lot of people who are trying to get into a venue very quickly, a crush happens. Crushes are very hard to stop when they've started. And not only having two doors open for this size of a venue is absolutely ludicrous. And I don't think a lot of people realize how bad crushes can get. You think, oh, well, I'm just going to pick up my friend. But when you're squashed in like this, and I've been in not so much life-threatening crushes, but I have been in mass casualty events, mass attendance events where I have been very, very tightly packed. I've even been in situations where I've been picked up as a 6'4" guy, being picked up off his feet by crowds and moved 2 meters by just people, that amount of crushing people. So, when crushes happen, you eventually just don't have enough oxygen to breathe. And so people would have died, as they said, from just standing up because their chest is compressed, they're unable to breathe, and they just pass out through asphyxiation and then unfortunately pass away. And in terms of when you fall down, you just get crushed. People just standing on you and not able to breathe. There's very little oxygen. Again, it's a terrible way to go. And it's such a tragedy that this happened, especially to, what would have been a very young population.
Hadn't started at all when the worst was happening. The band were completely unaware of what had happened and thought they were just playing an amazing concert. Their manager had been advised to cancel the show before the band went on, but he refused. Now you may think a manager refusing to cancel a show after hearing a lot of people just died sounds kind of awful, but he actually had a very good reason. His argument was that canceling the show would send those thousands of people in a rush back outside straight into the medical teams assisting the victims. The concert continued. But how bizarre is that thought?
Yeah, so that's a pretty bizarre thought there. As event organizers, we never want to have a situation where we are having to decide between the safety and the PR and the marketing and how much money is lost. If a lot of people have died, most people will cancel a show. But in this particular situation, it's even more interesting because if you cancelled the show, you'd have 20,000, 30,000 people leave the venue, and then they're running into the arms of the first aiders and then disrupting the first aid and the medical emergency that's happening outside. Don't forget, if you have 10 people or 11 people that have died in this particular situation, you've probably got roughly 20 to 30 people who are pretty much in need of medical attention outside. If you think about this from a casualty point of view, in war, when you have one person died, you usually have 3 or 4, maybe 5 people who are wounded or injured. So for every 10 people that, the 10, 11 people that have died, you probably had about 50 people who were injured or were requiring medical attention or screaming or requiring some sort of attention from emergency services. So I think in this particular situation, the fact that he stopped people from going outside and let the concert go on might have actually been a good call. Obviously, it doesn't sound like an ethical call or a moral call because, when you've got that many people died, having everyone else inside having a good time and just continue as if nothing happened. It's also, it's a difficult situation to be put in. Do you risk the lives of the people who are still outside or needing medical attention, or do you stop it because of the basically the tragedy that has just happened.
A band rocking out to thousands of wild fans who just trampled 11 people to death. The band members weren't told until after the concert about what had happened, and many in the audience didn't even know themselves until they went home and their families were crying of relief that they were alive. Members have discussed the incident at great length over the years, and the tragedy led to decades-long discussions on concert safety.
So last thing on this, the way to prevent this in the future would have been to open more doors, have the right amount of staff. You're having a concert, you know how many people are coming to the concert roughly before the concert starts. So you'll have a certain amount of tickets sold. If it's a sold out concert, then you definitely know how many tickets you have, because it's a sold out show. If it's not sold out, most event professionals will know based on the band's popularity and how many tickets are sold already, how many tickets are going to sell on the door. And from that sort of mentality, you can think about how many staff you're going to need. And you never should, as an event professional, skip out on ticketing staff and security, because they're the ones who keep everyone safe. So, having enough staff and having enough doors open, plus having metal barricades and having a safety management plan or a crowd management plan for outside of the venue is super important in this industry. And that's how this probably could have been averted.
Arianna Grande concert bombing. I don't like pop music, but this is just some cowardly shit. In 2017, Europe was in a heightened state of fear over terrorist attack from Islamic extremists when one of the worst ended up hitting Manchester, England. During a concert by pop star Ariana Grande that was attended by 14,000 mostly young girls, a needle-dick chicken shit waste of oxygen whose name is Fuckface had been waiting just outside with a visibly heavy backpack containing a really big nail bomb.
I like the description of the perpetrator there. Great description.
Nail bomb is a bomb with nails and screws and shards of metal attached to it so that when it explodes, it makes even more damage. What an asshole. He had been waiting in the nearby train station for a couple of hours, and while some officers were initially suspicious of him, they didn't have much to go off of. Right as the concert ended and thousands of people began to leave, the little asshole made his way into the crowd of teens and waiting parents when he detonated.
Oh my god.
It's a bomb. Panic and pandemonium follow as Ariana's young fans and their parents climb over seats and barriers, desperate to get out. Outside, a police...
So that's also another issue when we have mass casualty events, is the panic that insets afterwards. So you might, in terms of the terrorist attack like this, we have panic that erupts immediately after a bomb goes off. And that can be even more devastating sometimes if they don't have the right evacuation procedures, because people get trampled, people get hurt, and when people are running for their lives and people are in sort of a flight or fight mentality, usually a flight mentality in a situation like this, it's people sort of disregard the normal rules and decorum of, being a normal human being. They don't care if they have to push people out of the way. They're out protecting their families, their kids, their friends, they are just after, protecting themselves. I have a degree in security counterterrorism, so I can leave a little bit more insight into this particular incident, as it is a terrorist attack. So obviously Islamic terrorism was a massive thing 10 years ago. It's not so much a massive deal now. We face more issues nowadays from extreme right-wing parties and from other sources such as state actors, which I won't mention because we all know who they are. But essentially, Islamic terrorism, is still a threat, but it's no longer as massive as a threat as it used to be. And with this particular attack, though, these IED explosives are extremely difficult to prevent, because these explosives can be made with homemade ingredients. Essentially, you don't need military explosives like C4 or Semtex or anything like that. You can just use basic household appliances, fertilizer, to create these explosive devices, which most of the times are, in this particular case, is a great example of where they've integrated both explosives with just shrapnel, nails, screwdrivers, marbles, not screwdrivers, but screws. These were commonly used in Iraq and Afghanistan during the occupations of ISAF forces. But anyways, I'm not going to go too much more into this. It's a horrible attack, and they're very difficult to prevent because you just don't know what people are carrying on their backs most of the time.
Dash cam caught the moment the terrorist detonated the bomb.
22 innocent people were killed in the blast, with another 239 injured physically. Of the dead, 10 were under the age of 20 years old. It was discovered that the attacker had strong ties with extremist groups and even had spent time with terrorist organizations in Libya. The bombing was one of the worst terrorist attacks to take place in Britain and traumatized the nation. Little bitch. Number 7.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about mass casualty events like this in the events industry, so I'll put it a little bit more into context about how we prevent this. First of all, we've become a long way in the events industry to prevent these sort of attacks from happening. The first thing we do is having security at the door that will do pat down and metal detector searches. The next is preventing people with large backpacks from actually entering the venue. And of course, we have very much a strong police presence at mass events like this, and quite commonly you will see armed police officers at these events just in case a mass casualty event happens or there is needed an armed response really quickly. So when we're thinking about this particular incident, this is very difficult to prevent because it wasn't really in the sort of scope and the responsibility of the concert organizers and the concert promoters, which probably was Live Nation or yeah, it was more unlikely Live Nation that was the promoter for this, the internal promoter, and also the ticketing promoter, and pretty much everything because they own everything. But so this attack obviously happened in a train station, which is outside of the rules of and the responsibilities, both legally and ethically, of the venue. But the unfortunate thing, obviously, the venue and whoever the concert is for will get blamed or, will be in the news. So it's always the bad press from that. However, in this particular case, when you think about the event industry and what we do to try and prevent it, it's, we'll prevent it by, obviously, what I said just earlier. But if it's in a train station, there's not really much we can do because it's a public area, it's a public space, and that becomes the jurisdiction of the police and of the security that work at train stations and any sort of public place. So we don't have the authority to put our own private security or any sort of force in there because they don't have the jurisdiction, and that comes under local government. And that's why a lot of these mass events will have not so much security, but will have more police at the train stations. And as you saw in the video, there was police there, but they can't stop everyone, and they have to have sort of just cause to stop someone to search their property. I'm not too savvy on the laws here in the UK in terms of stop and search, but I know that it's illegal in some countries it's legal. So I'm not too privy into the laws of that, but yeah, you have to have probable cause, and it didn't seem like they had probable cause just to stop someone with a backpack on in a train station.